Well, good afternoon, and welcome to the New America Foundation. We are pleased that you are here today. My name is David Gray. I direct the Workforce and Family Program. And on behalf of New America, it's a joy to welcome you to this event on the scandal of reform, revisiting bosses and reformers in New York and rethinking urban political reform. I'd also like to thank those people who are joining us on the internet, watching this as we broadcast live. The issue of political reform, campaign finance, and how we do elections is really at the heart of our democracy. All the issues that we see both at the state and the federal level that Congress and state legislatures are struggling at really comes down to what kind of representation the people have. And Frankie Berry has written a fascinating book which takes the view of historical perspective on one city but has broad implications. Frankie has joined us from New York this morning, so he brings the perspective very fresh from that city of what's gone in New York historically, and a city that has both a fascinating combination of very generous campaign finance laws but very uncompetitive elections. And he's taken a work that attempts to look at some of the history of that city's elections and then take a broader view of maybe what some other urban reformers have thought throughout the ages and what some other cities are doing. And we thought we would be wise to have him here to talk to us a little bit and to those who are going to be watching about his experience in writing the book, about what the book seeks to do, and then what lessons we can draw from Frankie's work that can be helpful to our local, state, and federal folks as they try to look at how we make sure that our democracy is as strong as possible, which really comes down to how fair and representative our legislatures and our public officials are. So we're thankful that Frankie is joining us today. Frankie Berry is the Director of Speechwriting and a Senior Policy Advisor to New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg, and the author of The Scandal of Reform, which we're selling outside following the event. Secondly, I'm going to introduce Stephen Hill, who's the Director of the Political Reform Program here at New America, who I believe is joining us from California over the phone. Stephen, are you here? Can you hear us?
I am here, thank you.
Isn't this great, the technology of New America? In honor of our California program, I am not wearing a necktie today. So Stephen, welcome. Thanks for taking time this morning on your busy schedule to be with us.
It's my pleasure. Looking forward to it.
And then Mark Schmidt, who is the editor of the American Prospect and a good friend of the New America Foundation, and someone who has both a keen interest in the New York region and New York politics, New Jersey politics, from his own political background and policy experience, someone who's helped direct policy here at New America, and from a journalistic background has a broad perspective on the overall campaign finance system. And we're thankful, Mark, that you've taken time to be with us again today. So with that, we're looking forward to Frankie talking for a bit, and then for some comments from Stephen and from Mark, and then look forward to your questions and a discussion. So thank you again for joining us, and please join me in welcoming Frankie Berry.
Well, thank you all for coming out for this. I really appreciate it. Giving a welcome to a New Yorker, and I hope that the issues that I'll talk about will have resonance for wherever you come from, whether it's D.C. or elsewhere, and I think they will. The book grew out of a thesis that I began writing back in 2002 on nonpartisan elections. But before we get into really the issues of the book, I thought it would be useful to talk about something that just happened in New York, which was our municipal election. We just had a primary election for all municipal offices: city council, borough president, public advocate, controller, and mayor. And I think the results of those elections provide really the perfect context for talking about reform and what has gone awry with it. In those elections, and there's been a lot of discussion about some of the scandal of them, if you will, the biggest being that there was such low voter turnout. In a city with about 3 million registered Democrats, we had about 350,000 Democrats come out for a primary election. That's about 11 or 12%. Prior to that, prior to even people getting a chance to vote, of course, there was the great New York tradition of ballot bumping, where the candidates would joust with each other to try to knock the other off the ballot, based on all kinds of arcane election laws that go back to the Progressive era. So if you were lucky enough to stay on the ballot, there was an election on September 15th. About 350,000 out of 3 million voters came out. And in many of those races, you had actually some competitive races. In the primary, you had a number of candidates running. And in some of them, the winner of the election only won about 30% of the vote. Now, if you don't win a majority in New York, you are forced to go in a runoff only if you're running for a citywide office. That's mayor, public advocate, or controller. So there were 2 runoffs for public advocate and controller, and no runoffs for any of the city council races. So what we have in New York, and this happened in September, and it happens really every election, is we have sometimes highly competitive primaries in which we have multiple candidate fields of 3, 4, 10 candidates running, and many instances where the winner will receive about sometimes as low as 20% of the vote, sometimes 25, 30, 35% of the vote, and will advance to the general election. Now, in a competitive 2-party system, that you might think might make sense, and then there will be a competitive race in November. In New York, we don't have a competitive 2-party system. There is effectively no Republican Party, and there hasn't been one for about 30 years, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But so some of the characteristics that we saw extremely low voter turnout. We saw ballot bumping. We saw plurality winners rather than majority winners. And another defining feature that we saw, and we have seen at every election going back 100 years, is the exclusion of independents. Those who do not register with one party or the other. Now, they're the fastest growing group of voters in the country. There are about 700,000 independent voters in New York City. That's more independents than Republicans. There are about 18% of the electorate is independent, and about 15 or 14% are Republicans. But these independents don't get to come out and vote in the primary because we have what are called closed primaries. It's also what you have in Washington for municipal elections. It's what Philadelphia has and Baltimore has, and New York. Now, in all of these cities, the results are startlingly the same, where you have these low turnout elections deciding nominees, often by 20, 25, 30% of the vote, and then moving them to a general election in which they face no competition. Taken to its logical extreme, we know that competition drives turnout. Without competition, people don't come out to vote. Now, in New York, we often have a competitive mayoral race, and that brings people out to vote. In other cities, that's not always the case. Baltimore is a good example of that. In Baltimore, we've actually seen elections where there are more voters coming out in a primary election, more Democrats coming out in a primary election than there are entire voters coming out in a November election. Turnout actually has declined in Baltimore between the primary election of just Democrats and the open general election of all voters. So this is a condition that is rarely commented on because it's something that we have almost taken for granted in many cities. We assume that in big cities that are full of Democrats that outnumber Republicans, in New York's case, by 5 to 1, we assume that this is almost the right of the Democratic Party to nominate who they want and then show up in November and walk away with the election. But that has not always been the way it was, and we tend to think that it is the way it is and always has been, but that's actually not true. And so I'd like to spend a little bit of time before we begin talking about what we can do to actually improve competition and improve participation and improve majority victors, talk a little bit about how we got here, which is really kind of the first piece of the scandal of reform. We tend to think of reformers as the angels of democracy, the good guys who float above partisan politics and tell it like it is, the nonpartisans. And that is their reputation, but it's not one that they've come by honestly in many cases. If you look back at the 19th century, the early reformers were elites who wanted to disenfranchise those without property, those who couldn't read, African Americans, and immigrants. So the early reform movements was really it was not about expanding the vote. It was not about opening up democracy. It was about creating almost an aristocratic form of government where those who own property could hold power. So that was the 19th century reform movement, which did evolve into the progressive era. But it got this was not something that was just a band of few reformers. In New York, they got very close to taking away the vote from anyone who didn't hold $300 or $500 worth of property. They got it through the state legislature, and they were one vote away from passing an amendment to the state constitution that would have effectively wiped out the vote for about 2/3 of the entire state's electorate. And it was the party bosses and the party organizations that really rallied around candidates who would oppose these restrictions. They beat the reformers' candidates, and they protected the vote. So in some ways, those early machines, for all of their reputation for corruption, which was deserved, nevertheless were the protectors of the vote for the common man. Now, moving into the progressive era, very slowly, the reformers did begin to liberalize their thinking in terms of who should have the right to vote. And they began fighting for laws that would not disenfranchise people, but that they thought would help their own, help independents, help those who were not a nominee of the party machine. And they saw Tammany Hall, for instance, big party machine, as a monopoly in the same way that they saw John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil as a monopoly. And they wanted to go after them. They went after Rockefeller legislatively with the Antitrust Act, and they went after Tammany Hall and the party machines with legislative regulations. We often don't think of our election laws as regulations, but that's really all they are. So they succeeded in beating Rockefeller, but they did not succeed in beating Tammany. In fact, their election laws strengthened Tammany Hall. We often think of Tammany as the juggernaut. They could elect anybody they want to. They're a powerful political machine, and we've seen powerful machines in other cities. But in fact, before reformers passed their election laws, beginning in 1890, Tammany Hall was constantly competing with other factions at the polls for victories, and they were not a dominant party machine. They often lost races. And it was because that those races were not just decided in party nominating meetings or primaries that we have today, they were decided by all voters in the general election. So even though in the 19th century in New York, the Republican Party exceptionally weak, there were incredibly competitive general elections in New York because there was a very dynamic field of Democratic candidates who competed against each other for office and for control of the party. With the passage of progressive era laws, that effectively was eliminated. The parties began to control the ballot because they now had the machinery to do so. The legislature empowered them through the Board of Elections to effectively control who were the nominees, and it forced anyone who wanted to challenge the party not to do it internally, but to not to do it in a general election, but to do it in a primary nominating meeting, and that became impossible. So candidates began forming fusion campaigns. We saw in the passage of the direct primary, which happened, was a tremendous victory for reformers across the country. The passage of the direct primary served, though, to undermine in many ways the fusion campaigns that reformers had built. In many ways, the reformers got a lot of things wrong in those days. Both from a policy perspective of the 19th century and then pragmatically in the way their laws played out. Tammany Hall was never so successful as in the elections that followed the reformers' election reforms. Between 1913 and 1932, Tammany never lost an election in the mayor's race, which is something that they had never done prior to the passage of these reforms. So this is all to say that the reform parable is not as straightforward as we're often led to believe. It's much more complicated. And one of the challenges of this book, I think, is to begin re-examining that parable and re-examining laws that we have generally accepted that have been handed down to us from the progressive era, which holds kind of an exalted place in American history, and begin asking whether or not these laws are really serving us and whether they're really serving democracy and whether they're achieving the goals, of reformers. One of those goals was to empower independents, of course, and we know that independents are today effectively shut out of the process. So, anyway, that's a little history. Moving on from here, if before talking about possible solutions, let's talk about a couple that are popular and that probably or definitely will not solve the problem of lack of competition and a need for greater participation. One of them, I think, is campaign finance reform. I worked for several years for New York City's campaign finance reform program, probably the most progressive in the nation. Gives out public funds to candidates who raise a certain amount of money on a match of about $6 in public funds to $1 for every raised in private money. The program has been very successful in helping grassroots candidates compete in a primary election. It has been a terrible failure in creating more competitive elections in the general election, which is what, of course, the great problem is. New York has had generally competitive primary elections for some time. We have had abysmally competitive general elections going on 30 years since really the collapse of the Republican Party in the 70s. As the National Party went rightward, so many Republican parties locally in the Northeast began to decline, and that was certainly true of New York. So we even have a somewhat perverse effect in New York where campaign finance reform intended to empower candidates without organizational support and intended to empower candidates not of the Democratic machine. Nevertheless, we end up giving Democratic candidates, in some cases, twice as much as Republican candidates, because you can qualify for public funds if you have a primary, but not if you only have a general election. Republicans don't have primaries. Democrats do. They get twice the amount in public funds. Campaign finance reform can do many things. One of them that it cannot do is, in a one-party town, create competitive general elections. That is also true of redistricting, often thought of as a panacea. Out in California, they passed a ballot referendum on this last year. But in a place where people are geographically located by ideology in some sense, redistricting does not make any difference. In New York City, it would marginally improve the competitiveness of a couple of races. That would be true in Washington or Philadelphia or anywhere else where the Democrat would continue to win nearly every race, and then in the general election you'd have no competition. Now, as a Democrat, the purpose of this is not to usher in this new Republican boom. The purpose of this exercise is to begin thinking, as Democrats, don't we deserve some competition on election day? Most Democrats don't show up at the polls on primary day, and yet when they come out in November, they're left with basically no choice but to rubber stamp their party's nominee. And so the purpose of this exercise is really about creating competition for all voters, not just independents, not just Republicans who are showing up for the first time in November, but for Democrats as well. So what can we do? There are a few options, and I think one of them certainly is one that Stephen Hill has written extensively about, and I'm sure he will talk about, which is instant runoff voting. There are other types of voting systems that would be improvements on what we have, including approval voting. And I'm sorry if I'm moving past instant runoff voting. I'm sure Stephen will explain it, and many of you may be familiar with it. But it's a system that allows you basically to rank your choices, one through whatever, and therefore effectively avoid the need for a runoff election. Another option is nonpartisan elections, and that's the subject of a good part of this book. The idea of nonpartisan elections was something that grew out of the progressive era. It was another thing that they got wrong, which was they thought nonpartisan elections would empower independents to challenge the party machines. That proved to be not the case, as in so many other things that they thought might happen. Cities that adopted nonpartisan elections, like Jersey City, like Kansas City, continued to have very strong democratic machines. So what is the benefit of nonpartisan elections then? Nonpartisan elections would basically, and about 80% of cities around the country have it, basically takes all candidates, put them in the same pool in a primary election, no matter what party they belong to, and it invites all voters to participate in that election, no matter what party they belong to. Washington State has adopted this type of system. The voters approved it. So in effect, you've got kind of an all-comers election, voters and candidates, and then the top two candidates, no matter what party they belong to, are then advanced to the general election, and voters have a choice between two presumably competitive races. This both eliminates the disenfranchisement of independents, it eliminates the ability of someone to squeak by in a low turnout primary election with only 20% of the vote. And it gives those who don't show up on the first primary day a real choice on the general election. That is why many cities have adopted it. There's also, of course, some anti-party feeling around the country. But a good case is a case like Jacksonville, Florida, which found in one election that the voters didn't have a choice for mayor. It was only one party that had nominated a candidate. And there was almost a kind of a civic scandal that erupted, and people felt, well, wait a second, even if there's only one Democratic nominee, isn't there another candidate running? And of course, there had been a primary, and people felt cheated. They felt like they hadn't had a voice. And so Democrats and Republicans in Jacksonville joined together, and they adopted nonpartisan elections. There are various types of nonpartisan elections. Sometimes they have labels on the ballot. Sometimes they don't. Jacksonville, they do. In 2003, Mayor Bloomberg appointed a commission to study nonpartisan elections and ultimately put forward a ballot proposal on the issue that would have allowed party labels on the ballot. And it was defeated by a tremendously lopsided vote of 70 to 30%. And I like to claim credit for having been responsible for one of Mayor Bloomberg's terrible defeats. Kidding, as someone who works for him. But sometimes I think good ideas take a little while to explain, to sink in, as I'm sure Stephen Hill has found with instant runoff voting. In 1915, the voters of New York turned down women's suffrage in a statewide referendum. 2 years later, they passed it. Sometimes reforms take a little while for people to come to terms with, to accept. I'm running a little low on time here, so I'll begin wrapping up. But one of the reasons why we were unsuccessful in 2003, and one of the great disappointments for me as someone who worked in campaign finance reform and worked with the good government groups, was that almost without exception, the good government groups, the civic groups, opposed us. They said that nonpartisan elections were anti-party. They said that they would be bad for minorities. They said that they would be bad for turnout. And all of these claims came from literature that was written largely in the 50s and 60s, some of it more recently, but that was the preponderance of it, looking at cities out west largely and looking largely at small towns. So rather than looking at the facts on the ground, rather than looking at New York's kind of unique conditions, rather than looking at the one-party dominance that has existed for so long, the traditional response was, well, one, it's independents' fault if they don't join a party, and two, it's the Republicans' fault if they can't field a real race. I suppose you could take that, but we structure election laws, or we should, I think, for the benefit of voters and not for the benefit of parties. So one of the purposes in writing this book, in some ways, was really a challenge to those groups and to Democrats in general, who in many ways are champions of urban democratic reform, to begin looking and to begin focusing not so much on Congress for national solutions, but to begin by first looking at our own cities and begin kind of divorcing ourselves from our own partisan preferences. And that is one of the arguments that I make, is that for all of the decrying of the partisanship that reformers often do, and one of the things that the old reformers got right was that they really were nonpartisan. Today's reform groups, in many ways, mirror traditional liberal special interest groups. The old bipartisanship on their boards and committees is gone. The coalition and ticket balancing and such that defined those old groups is gone. And today, in many ways, the groups have become more of traditional liberal interest groups that ally themselves with other liberal groups to push for liberal solutions. And I think that has also that hurt their objectivity in 2003 and has hurt their objectivity in looking at reforms that in kind of turning a blind eye really to conditions in many cities, New York, Philadelphia, Washington, elsewhere, that have really decimated what was once a very healthy, democratic, vibrant process before the regulations came in. So like any regulation, they need updating from time to time. And I think that election laws are no exception. and that we need to begin rethinking some of these progressive era election laws that are in some cases 100 years old. And as much talk as there is these days about a new progressive era in all kinds of different areas, I think in election reform, for that to happen, we cannot march blindly towards a campaign finance reform system, for instance, or even redistricting. We really need to begin looking at the conditions on the ground, and I think beginning with cities where democratic form has so often grown out of, it would be a very good place to start. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Frankie. As Frankie mentioned, Stephen Hill has been a leader in California on a variety of ideas to increase voter participation and to rethink campaign finance generally. We've heard about New York's experience a bit, and Frankie, of course, talks about it extensively in the book, but as he mentioned, there are a variety of jurisdictions who are doing a lot of creative things in this area, and there is no place that has been more dynamic in rethinking about democracy and participation than the state of California. And so we're glad that, Stephen, you've taken a moment to be with us, perhaps to comment on what you've heard, to think about the experience of California and what the nation could learn, or New York could learn from what California has tried to do and what has gone well and what is left to be done. So, Stephen?
Thank you, David, and thank you to Frankie for that very interesting presentation. And I want to say that your book, Frankie, The Scandal of Reform, is really fascinating, not only for a number of reasons. One, you dealing with reform and what can work, what are the criteria by which we're pushing reform to accomplish what goals, but also it's a rather interesting personal journey of your own dealing with reform in New York City, as well as a really interesting and helpful reflection on the dilemmas of reformers. And reformers, we like to think of ourselves as having the best of reasons for doing what we're doing, but sometimes, in my experience, reformers part ways because we can't agree on what the goals are. Or, and we're going through a situation right now in California where we're trying to craft a constitutional convention. And let me tell you, trying to herd cats into the wheelbarrow and people, trying to design a constitutional convention so that they may be appointed as a delegate. People have all sorts of conflicting desires and priorities sometimes when it comes to reform, and we have to do the best that we can. So, on many different levels, I think your book is very much a valuable contribution to the field here, and I commend you for taking it on. Writing a book is an enormous task, and and good luck with getting the discussion out there. So now moving on a little bit to the substance of what you're talking about. And David, I assume you'll maybe let me know, how long should I talk for here? A few minutes or 10 minutes? Or what?
No more than 10.
Okay, so if you can let me know when I'm at 9, that would be helpful. The part of the dilemma with reform is that sometimes the reforms of today and that we pass today to address the issues of today, 10, 15, 20 years from now, the situation on the ground has changed. And so, and reform is hard to pass. You have a lot of vested interest in keeping the status quo. So sometimes reforms tend to lag behind the problem. And keeping in mind that reform is driven by problems. It's hard to pass reforms until you've identified the problem that you're trying to fix, and then you come forward and say, here, I have the unique solution to that problem. So there's a problem solution cycle to any reform effort. And oftentimes, as I said earlier, the problem that you identified 15, 20 years from now is no longer the problem that you have to fix, and yet you still have the same reform, the same institutions and structures that you've created that may need to be adjusted. And so I think a lot of times what we see is that kind of dynamic going on. So, for example, the Voting Rights Act, which in 1965 was probably the most significant civil rights legislation that had been passed since, including the Civil Rights Act of 1965, 1964, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, was the most important legislation since the freeing of the slaves. And part of the Voting Rights Act was drawing single-member districts for minority representation. because in the past, districts had been drawn in such a way to exclude minority representation. So the Voting Rights Act gave impetus to drawing districts in a way that would maximize minority representation. But as everyone has seen over the ensuing decades, it really helps minority groups who are racially segregated, where you can draw a district around them. But what happens with a minority group who is spread out? It becomes harder to draw a district for them. And so it also provides an incentive to remain racially segregated, which in an integrating society is not optimal. So there's pros and cons. Independent redistricting commissions, Frankie alluded to that, and it's certainly true that at a certain time, people thought taking redistricting out of the hands of the incumbents and the party leaders would produce good things. And certainly I think, independent redistricting commissions are better than leaving it in the hands of the partisans to draw the district line. But on the other hand, we've seen this kind of sorting by partisan residential demographics, where Democrats tend to dominate cities and the coastal areas, and Republicans dominate more of the rural areas and the flyover zones, as they're called in the United States. And so it becomes really hard to draw a district that's competitive, no matter who's drawing the district lines. And in some ways, demographics have trumped the ability of the line drawers to really impact elections. And so these are some of the dilemmas that we have to face. Let me just look at something here real quick. Well, anyway, and sometimes we have to water down our reforms because of, for example, here in California, we had the blanket primary, where voters going into the polls could vote. They'd see on their ballot the candidates from all the different parties, and they could vote cross-party in all different races. And that was in the late 90s. The Supreme Court ruled that you cannot force parties to use a type of primary they don't like. They didn't throw out the blanket primary. They didn't say it was unconstitutional to use it. They just said you can't force parties to use a primary they don't like. And so that's led to all these sorts of acrobatics since then, trying to get back to what is some see as a golden day in California politics, which I think actually the facts don't support that it was such a golden day. But there's this nostalgia for it. So it's led to this sort of perverted version of it called the top two primary that now people are pushing. That it really is quite different than the blanket primary, but people are assuming it's going to do the same thing, and when it won't do it at all, in some ways it's deform masking as reform. So these, sometimes we water things down in an attempt to get something that can either get around the legalities or can get a majority of votes on the ballot, and in some ways we undermine our efforts. The other point I'll perhaps finish up with is that one of the other dilemmas is that you can increase competition in elections, and generally speaking, I think we should try to do that. And Frankie alluded to that. But keep in mind that when you increase competition, you run the risk of actually decreasing representation. And it's particularly true in a winner-take-all electoral system. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Let's say you're having a city like New York City where the incumbents are winning elections with 80%, 70% of the huge landslides. Most of the incumbents are winning, and most of them, of course, are Democrats. So now let's say we can draw the districts in such a way to make all those districts so that the winners are going to win with 51% to 49%. In doing that, you've made all the elections more competitive. That's good. But it also means you've increased the number of voters in that district who actually cast a vote for a loser. Because now, instead of having only 20% of voters voting for a loser and a race decided 80-20, you have 49% of voters who are voting for a loser. And, to wallpaper over this uncomfortable fact that in the best of worlds, in a competitive election, in the winner-take-all races, that many voters are what I call orphaned voters. Democrats living in Republican districts, Republicans living in Democratic districts, and, of course, third-party voters living in any of these districts who don't elect anyone. We say, well, the person represents you even though, they represent you just because they sit in the chair, in other words, even though you didn't vote for that person, and even though they are, in some cases, many cases, diametrically opposed to your point of view. Nevertheless, that person, quote, represents you. And you hear, political scientists, you hear League of Women Voter types, you hear all sorts of people saying this thing all the time. And this is a rather odd notion of representation that really turns representation on its head, in my view. And so, really, the crux of the problem is the winner-take-all electoral system, which takes these two important democratic values, competition and representation, and pits them against each other. And really, it's the only electoral system in the world that allows both of these important democratic values, competition and representation, to not be pitted against each other is systems of proportional representation, which are used by most of the established democracies in the world. And I really think that this is the direction that city politics, city elections need to go in, as well as elections for Congress. I mean, there's not a single Republican member of the House of Representatives right now from New England. Not one. It didn't used to be that way. It used to be Rockefeller Republicans and other Republicans got elected in various states in New England, and now at this point they're all Democrat. And there are other parts of the country where Democrats don't win any seats. It's only Republicans. And so we've created these political monocultures in which not only is there no competition, but there's no real debate of ideas. There's no discussion of the important issues of our times because one side is winning everything and the other side can barely even muster candidates because they don't have the resources and who's going to, what candidate is going to agree to be a sacrificial lamb to run against a Republican, in a district where the Republican is going to win 80% of the vote, or vice versa for a Democratic district that's heavily Democratic. So I think there are a number of reforms out there that we need to be working on that would really open up the political field, allow Americans to look out there in the political landscape, see points of view from the left, the right, the center, and really have choice for the first time in ever, really. I mean, the choice we have in American politics is that you, the voter, get to ratify the candidate of the party that dominates your district. And that's true oftentimes even in nonpartisan elections. In San Francisco, where I live, all the members of the Board of Supervisors are Democrats. And everyone knows they're Democrats, and if a Republican tried to run in San Francisco, his or her opponent would quickly out them as a Republican, and that would be the end of their candidacy. It's really unfortunate, but that's just a simple fact, and a lot of that is driven by the electoral system. So I think not only in addition to changing our winner-take-all electoral system to something like proportional representation, we need to be using methods like instant runoff voting when we're electing single winner offices like mayor, governor, or even president for a national direct election, in which voters are allowed to rank a first, second, and third choice, and which you as a voter know that if your first choice can't win, you haven't lost your vote. You can vote for Ralph Nader, and you can put Al Gore second, or you can vote for Ross Perot and put George Herbert Walker Bush as second. So you're really not stuck in this lesser of two evils mentality that we have now, where you think, well, I like so-and-so, but I can't vote for her or him because they don't have a chance of winning, so I got to vote for my lesser of two evils. So it really liberates voters to vote for the candidate that you like, and in that way, I think opens up the elections. I think public financing of campaigns of some type is certainly extremely important, and even beyond that, things like universal voter registration. The United States is really kind of at the bottom of the barrel in terms of the percentage of our eligible Americans who are actually registered to vote. And there are things that we can do that's being done already all over the world that actually would increase that as well. So, I mean, there's a number of things that we need to do, and in very many ways, there's a number of groups out there trying to push these ideas, but it's slow going because Americans are so stuck to the flypaper of old ideas and thinking that somehow we are the United States and what we do is the best, and when in fact, in many ways, our practices are rooted in the 18th and 19th centuries. They're hardly fit for a 21st century society of, where people, you have people living next door to each other, say, for example, a Republican businessman living next door to a Democratic Latina single mom living next door to an independent Korean businessman living next door to a libertarian computer programmer living next door to a Green Party environmentalist. These people all live in the same neighborhood, and yet in our antiquated 18th century-based system, only one of them is going to receive representation in most instances, depending on the electoral system used. So these, I think, are the methods of a previous century, and we need to really seriously upgrade our democracy into the 21st century.
Great, thank you.
That's the end of my comments.
Those are great comments. Stephen, thank you very much. A book on reform, and I know you're doing real reform work in California. Thank you for that and for your comments. Now I'd like to introduce Mark Schmidt, who's the editor of the American Prospect, who has worked on political campaigns. He's written about them. He's observed both the kind of local politics that Frankie's written on in the Northeast, in the New Jersey, New York area, as well as in the national scene here in Washington. So we're glad, Mark, you're with us. Mark?
I'll just stay where I am.
Here just from the video standpoint, it'll help if you come up here. You sit down for Q&A. Thanks.
Thanks. I'm always glad to be back here at this podium. I'd just like to say first, I really loved. I guess I really loved the first half of this book, and I really appreciated the historical context. And I think what Frankie did was something almost overdue in a historical sense, which was to sort of breathe some life into that tradition of nonpartisan municipal reform, which had really been, which really kind of has had a bad name ever since, Richard Hofstadter talked about the status anxiety of reformers, and really been treated largely as just, the WASPs trying to, not hold back the emerging ethnic politics and as a kind of lifeless thing. I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, and the reform thing there was always the reform against the machine. And somebody just a couple of years ago, I was back, and a friend of my family said, the whole thing they called reform was really just code for we're not Italian, and that was really all it came down to. And I think Frankie captures all that. But at the same time, I think breathes some new respect into the goals of those reformers, especially to the extent that they weren't just about ethnic status anxiety and so forth. But I think it's a really a neglected tradition, both between the historians' kind of more dismissal of it, and also as political scientists in particular and writers generally kind of saw more value in urban political machines. They saw them as means of delivering services and really means of civic engagement, whether in the form of parties or clubs. As we looked at 10 years ago, people were Robert Putnam wrote Bowling Alone. There was a concern about a kind of emaciated public sphere, and people saw there was almost a nostalgia about urban political machines for the degree to which they provided a kind of thick civil society. And I think those two things together have kind of led to a real neglect of this reform tradition, which is a really honorable tradition. And I think if in large part, and when one's around New York, and I think this is true in Chicago, Boston, it's true in a lot of cities, that reform tradition, which you almost feel in places like the Bar Association of the City of New York, for example, deeply bipartisan, it's a really fascinating force in a city's politics, and one that we neglect at our own expense, and one which I think has a continual life, and in many ways I do think some of the initiatives that Mayor Bloomberg had put forward do bring some new life to that. As we get into the present, I think I want to take issue with a couple of Frankie's points. One on sort of a small, sort of almost a trivial point. When you say there's no Republican Party in New York City, I was born in New York. I think I was born at the tail end of the Robert Wagner administration, and I was figuring for a majority of my lifetime, the mayor of New York has been someone who was first elected as a Republican. So it's an interesting. That's not to say they were typical. I mean, Rudy Giuliani was. Lindsay and Bloomberg were really nominal Republicans, but they, in a sense, the Republican Party served as a kind of safety valve, especially in the latter two cases, in an interesting way, especially for that executive leadership, and that's obviously not true down the line. But it's really fascinating to me how much it's the case that in places that are overwhelmingly democratically dominated, voters use the Republican Party as a kind of safety valve. In Connecticut, for example, 2-to-1 Democratic registration. State's had a Republican governor for, I think, since I've been in college, decades. same in Rhode Island, same in Vermont had a Republican governor for a long time. So it serves as a kind of check, I think, and which is not to say that's not the same as a healthy party. It's a very different kind of thing, but it's not nothing either, and it does show that there's some possibility there. The second issue that I want to talk about is when Frankie talked about, and this is very extensive in the book, and a lot of it involves people I know, so I'll try to be dispassionate about it. When Frankie talks about the current reformers in New York, folks like the people at New York Public Interest Research Group or the Brennan Center, for example, as being typical liberal special interests, I think sometimes in some cases that's true, in some cases that's not true. I think an organization like Citizens Union or at the national level, Common Cause has had much more struggle with those issues. In other cases, yeah, they're liberal interest groups at the same time that they're reform groups. I want to talk about that as a sort of interesting case of the dilemma of reform, because I came in, most people who become interested in political reform are probably interested in it for some other reason. I mean, I got interested in political reform issues when I was working on Capitol Hill in the 90s. I was working for Senator Bill Bradley from New Jersey. And after a while, I kind of felt like, well, all these things we were trying to do on health, education, welfare reform, there were really some fundamental issues with the process that I wanted to work on. So obviously I didn't come to it from a completely dispassionate, I just want to see a fair political process. I obviously thought there was some result you were going to get out of government that'd be slightly different if whether it was a matter of breaking gridlock or changing representation in some way. And it's a very small number of people who can come to political reform completely dispassionately. And if you're going to build any kind of popular pressure for political reform, it's got to draw on people who kind of expect there's going to be something different. Now, very often this is a ridiculous over-promising. You'll have people say, if we have campaign finance reform, all those industry groups will be out of the picture and you'll get health care reform. That's not right. That's a dramatic oversimplification. But obviously, if you're not connecting to people's actual lived passions, you're going to be right back there in that old WASP, world of the old line reformers who really have not, they have the luxury of thinking about nothing but reform. Most people don't have that luxury. I mean, I think so that I think you can have bipartisan and dispassionate reform groups, but they're going to be the kind of groups like the role that I think New America plays in California. They're going to be the kind of groups that provide information and analysis. They're not going to be groups that are able to generate a lot of public momentum, and I don't think you're going to achieve some of these goals without public momentum. So that's I think a point I would make about his about the comments on the reform groups. And finally, I just want to say I think it's always a frustration to me about the political reform world when people kind of get a reform and feel like it has to trump other reforms. And I think the treatment of I think I've always been a real advocate of the New York City campaign finance model in particular. And there's a passage here where Frankie says, it's always been acclaimed as the best model. I once wrote an article saying, why does this system get no respect? And I think it really hasn't been recognized as fully as a model. I think it's beginning to get respect as a model. There's always been more attention to what are called clean money systems. Clean money systems are those where essentially the aspiration is to kind of get rid of private money from elections altogether, so that once people reach a certain level of qualification through small donations, they accept a flat sum and agree to spend no more than that on their campaigns. Those systems tend to, and that sounds great. None of that private money. Those systems, because they're so closed-ended, you have systems like that in Maine, Arizona. You have one coming in Connecticut. Because those systems are fairly closed, it's a gamble. Choosing to participate in that system is a gamble. And so about half of candidates will participate in those systems. And if you think you're going to have a self-funded candidate or a well-funded candidate running against you, that's a tough choice to take. The great thing about New York City's system is it's kind of open-ended. You've got the what is now a 6-to-1 match on small contributions. All the incentives are there to seek small contributions, but you're not locking this. The overall spending limit is relatively high. You're not locking yourself in, and as a result, you have something like 95+% participation. And I think I think the reason the system's been has gone kind of unappreciated, frankly, is because of Mayor Bloomberg. So that people say, well, what kind of system is that? You got the mayor as the guy who spends, $95 million on his election. But what's significant to me about that always is it's a system that allows the mayor's opponent to reach a level where he can be heard. Mark Green in 2001 had $19 million. That's a decent. That's not. If you have $19 million to spend on your campaign in a city, that's sufficient. I think Ferrer in 2005 had $16 million. That's a good, to me, that's a good, you're always going to have self-funded candidates, and that's all right. The key in thinking about campaign finance is, do people reach the threshold where they can be heard, their ideas can be heard? And of course, for higher spending candidates, we know there's diminishing returns to the more you spend. So it's a real healthy system in which a large number of candidates participate, and it's I've never had an election experience like 2001 when I was living in Brooklyn, and we had 8 candidates in our district, and they all spent roughly the same amount of 8 city council candidates in our district. They all spent roughly the same amount of money, and they're all out on the street all the time because that was the way they were going to make a difference. Nobody was going to make a difference by spending more money. They were only going to make a difference by being more in contact with voters. The ultimate winner of that went through the primary to become the public advocate and defeated the candidate with more name recognition, was expected to win, Mark Green. It was Bill de Blasio who won. That's a pretty exciting thing. Now, yes, that is a primary. It's a primary in a section of Brooklyn that doesn't have a lot of Republicans. We're not going to have a lot of Republicans in Park Slope and Cobble Hill. It would be interesting if it were general. I think it would be perfectly fine to redefine that thing as a nonpartisan primary. I think it would probably be ideal to have that kind of primary be more or less what Frankie proposed, a nonpartisan primary with either a runoff or an instant runoff. You might have somewhat higher participation. It could also be an open Democratic primary so that independents and Republicans could participate. I think that would be fine too. And obviously getting a runoff into those city council races, whether a separate runoff or an instant runoff, probably better that it be an instant runoff for turnout purposes, would be healthy because you would avoid those winners with 30% of the vote. But when I think about that kind of race, I would much rather, if I had to choose between one or the other, if I had to keep only the campaign finance system as we know it, or a nonpartisan election system as Frankie proposed, I think that the campaign finance system is doing much more good toward the goal of making it possible for people to run, making it possible for different viewpoints to be heard, getting a broad debate, getting candidates engaged with voters, getting them out there, and creating incentives for people to be involved as donors, as small donors, which is a very valuable piece of it. And I think that I've been struck. Frankie cites some early research discrediting certain approaches to campaign finance reform. The Campaign Finance Institute here, which is run by Michael Malbin, who is actually a Republican as well as an academic, has published a lot of work very strongly supportive of the New York City system as a model for both congressional reforms and other things. So I would hate to in sort of trying to elevate the value of nonpartisan elections, feel like we have to trash the value of the city campaign finance systems, which I think is really a great gem and should be emulated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. I appreciate him talking about the Reformed tradition. As a Presbyterian pastor, I run a church when I'm not at New America. When I hear of old line reformers, I start thinking of John Calvin. And so it's refreshing when I hear about reforms in the relatively recent 18th century in my world. I want you to now to have an opportunity to ask some questions. While you're formulating your questions, I might give Frankie just a chance to comment on what he's heard from Stephen and Mark. In particular, I was interested in some of the discussions, a line about third parties and what role they might play in our country, there's always a question of, are we going to have a viable third party to challenge the two parties at the national level? And then Mark's threads around campaign finance was on my mind even before he started raising it, the role that the interplay between the finance laws and some of the broader structural reforms around election law that Frankie gets into. So let me raise those two, but really just a quick opportunity, and why don't you can stay seated for the rest of it, to respond to anything that quickly that struck your fancy from the two respondents.
Okay, well, I'll just pick up quickly on those two ideas then. The third parties issue is a big one, and different states treat third parties differently. In New York, you can they have what they call fusion voting, where third parties can endorse another party's nominee. But I think we should be looking for ways to empower third parties to challenge other parties at general elections. And what we're seeing in New York is that the third parties are acting more as factions than as third parties. The Working Families Party is kind of the new party on the rise, the ascendant party. They made a big splash in this year's September primary. It's basically kind of a grassroots organization. A lot of unions helped found it about 10 years ago. And they've basically replaced the Democratic Party in some ways as the muscle of the get out the vote operation. But they generally don't field their own candidates in November because that's not their interest. Their interest is in pulling the Democratic Party leftward. And that has always been the tradition of faction in New York. And it used to be that those factions competed in general elections. And now we have factions that are really competing with the party itself in primary elections, not in generals. They used to compete in both, I should say. And they're being determined in low turnout primaries. So it's interesting. Final point on that, one of the candidates in this year's race, David Yaskey, who was not endorsed by the Working Families Party, his opponent won in the runoff for comptroller, was quoted in the New York Times afterwards as saying, well, I just think it's, they asked why he lost, and he said, I just think it was very hard to win a very low turnout race without the kind of institutional support that my opponent had. And I think that's very telling. If we're going to stick with this system, it really does empower kind of the parties that are most organized to pull out their people and to win in an incredibly low turnout race. And then in November, when we'll probably have 1.3 million voters come out rather than 300,000, it won't matter in that race. That race is done. So. I think we should be looking for ways to empower third parties, and it's complicated, and instant runoff voting is certainly one of the best ways to do that. To respond quickly to one of the things Mark was talking about on campaign finance, and I hope that you don't come away with the idea that I was trashing the campaign finance program. I, having worked there, think it does an enormous amount of good. But the beauty of it is that this is not an either-or situation. We do not have to choose between campaign finance reform and nonpartisan elections or another system. And unfortunately, that was the choice that the Campaign Finance Board and the New York Times left with voters in some ways. They thought that for a variety of incredibly technical reasons that you can read in excruciating detail in the book, the Times argued, as the Campaign Finance Board argued, that nonpartisan elections would undermine the program. And I just don't think there's, and I go through in the book, I just don't find any credibility in the argument. I think we can have both. We can have both effective systems, and we can have the public financing empowering candidates, not only in a primary election, which is what's going on now, but also in a general election.
Great. Thank you, Frankie. All right, Oliver's got our microphone. He's going to come around, and if you have questions, just raise your hand. Please say your name and an organization if you're representing one. And the gentleman here. For either any three of us.
Cantor, I'm retired.
Yeah.
And I'm a Democratic activist, for what that's worth. I would like the two people here to comment on proportional representation. It seemed to me that comments about it, I mean, the two things I know about it is that in Israel, 5 or 10% of the electorate, that the other 90% or 95% disagree with, basically can control a significant policy. And in Europe, we have lots of countries with instability with proportional representation. So if the two people would comment.
And Stephen as well. Could you hear can you hear Stephen? Are you still there?
Yes, I was able to hear the question.
Yeah. All right. Great. All right. Any starters? Mark, do you want to?
It's actually a question Stephen can answer probably better.
Yeah. That's why I asked if he's still on. But all right.
Give him another time limit.
No, it's Stephen. Any thoughts on the question?
Sure. Well, there's a few ways to think about it. I mean, in terms of Israel for the longest time had a threshold of only 1% that you needed to win a seat in the legislature. And so with proportional representation, it's actually possible to fine-tune your democracy depending on what the victory threshold, as it's called, the percentage of vote you need to win a seat is. And so when you have a threshold of 1%, in many cases, you're going to get a proliferation of parties that win seats in the legislature and can lead to, fairly fractious coalition politics. Having said that, you have other countries that have a fairly low threshold that don't have the problems that Israel has. Israel's problems are much more than simply its electoral system. It has to do with it's basically a country that's been in a state of war for decades. And even within that, Israel has given representation to Arab parties in the Knesset, which I think is a rather remarkable accomplishment. But if you look at the vast number of countries in the world that are using proportional representation, and most established democracies do use it, not our winner-take-all system, they don't have the problems of Israel. You have to be careful to extrapolate about extrapolating from the experience of one country to all countries. And for example, the countries of Algeria and Angola use the U.S.-style winner-take-all electoral system. And yet we wouldn't say, because of that we're going to have the problems of Algeria and Angola, would we? So why would we say that any country that uses proportional representation is going to have the problems of Israel? And in terms of European democracies and being unstable, I would quibble with that characterization. I mean, I guess it depends on what you mean by stable. They have also parliamentary governments where they don't elect a chief executive like a president. Instead, the prime minister is the leader of the party that is the head of the coalition. And so you can have coalitions falling apart, and so countries like Italy, of course, is what's used as a prime example of that. But if you look at other countries like, Germany, Sweden, I mean, these are not unstable democracies by any means. And in fact, if the goal of a government is to deliver to the people, these are countries that all have, for example, universal health care. And they have health care where they're paying, 55% per capita GDP of what U.S. is paying for health care for getting better results. So, if that's unstable government, maybe the U.S. should try a little bit of a German-style or Swedish-style unstable government, because they deliver in many, many ways the goods to their people much more than the United States government does.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, the gentleman.
My name's Lee Diamond. I don't have an organization on this particular issue. I think that there could be a stronger and clearer focus here. I think Mr. Hill, hopefully his convention is going to deal with the initiative process, because that's what's destroying democracy in California. It's not really any of the issues I think that he talked about today so much. The initiative process brought Howard Jarvis and brought the term limits, among other policies that hamstring the government. It seems to me that the principle could be here, participation. What's going on in New England and around the country is not, why is that balkanization happening? I mean, that's politics. That's the Republican Party in New England, in my opinion. They've abdicated the center. So shouldn't we focus on participation? Shouldn't we focus on things that can be done without a constitutional amendment, which I assume proportional representation would require, redistricting, maybe instant runoff voting, things like that? And there's some clear thought process thoughts that are problematic with Mr. Hill's comments. He talked about competitive districts, and then, are you going to get 49% that aren't represented? Well, the map should draw the districts. There should be communities of interest. we could write criteria perhaps into the law for how you redistrict. I mean, that seems to me to make a lot more sense than some of the unfocused things that he was saying. So I would ask for that attention to some of those things.
All right. Stephen, do you want to respond?
Well, just briefly, because I would like to hear more of
Yeah.
what Frankie has to say
Yeah.
on these things.
Yeah.
But, I mean, again, it's the dilemma of representation versus competition. It doesn't matter what criteria you put in there. It doesn't matter who's drawing the district lines. If you start producing districts that are 51%, 49%, you've increased competition, but you've decreased representation because you now have more voters voting for losers. And the only way you can wallpaper over that is by saying that somehow the person who's sitting in the chair represents all the people that just voted for their opponent. And you can even see districts in which people are winning with 40, 45%. So there you have a situation where 60% of the voters in that district have voted for someone else. And so, you know, these are the dilemmas, and there's no easy solutions in the sense of that any electoral system has its pros and cons. But I think that this dilemma of representation versus competition is directly tied to voter participation. If voters feel like, you know, I mean, there are voters in this country that never vote for a winner because they live in the wrong district or even the wrong region. They live in the wrong state, in which, you know, it's impossible for a Republican to win certain states, or it's impossible for a Democrat to win. And third parties forget it. So these dilemmas are never going to go away because they are the product of the winner-take-all electoral system that we use. And I would submit to you they affect not only representation, they affect participation, they affect the debate and discussion of ideas, they affect the policy that comes out of the legislatures. Just looking at how, you know, the field captains of the parties they're experts at figuring out, okay, this district over here, we know we've got that one won. This district over here, we know we're never going to win that one. So we're going to focus on just a handful of swing districts because that's going to determine the majority in the legislature. And we're going to gear all our policies around the handful of swing voters in these swing districts that are going to decide the majority in the legislature. And so the policies that are discussed both during the campaigns and even the policies that are taken up during the legislative session are going to be to some degree geared to a handful of voters in a handful of districts, or and in case of national elections, in a handful of states that are going to decide the majorities and decide elections. This is not, in the 21st century, this is increasingly going to hurt the United States in policy formation, and other countries are not saddled with this because they're not using our winner-take-all system.
Great. All right, let's see. Frankie and Mark, do you have any thoughts on the question or on what Stephen shared?
I would just say real quickly, I think Stephen is right that there are, you know, dilemmas in any reform, and there's kind of trade-offs that you deal with. I would just, you know, point out one of them maybe. Even though in a 51-49 case, if you have managed to create a more competitive election, and in California and in New York, you can't do that by redistricting, you can do it by other means, but you know, the downside is you've got 49% of the people, as Stephen said, who have now voted for a loser. The upside is that chances are, because you created a 51-49 race rather than an 80-20, about, you know, I don't know, 30% more, or who knows what the number is, more people have come out to vote. So you've increased participation by creating more competition, even though some of those people will have come out and voted for, or half of those people have come out and voted for someone who they didn't want representing them. The other thing I would just say at a local level versus, say, a national level representation is that so often local politics is not about the ideology. It's not even about the legislation. People often vote for candidates based on, you know, who's delivering the pork back home, which is why you sometimes have Republicans representing Democratic districts and vice versa. So I think on a local level anyway, you know, the question of what is representation is not as ideological as perhaps it is on the federal level.
Let me bring Mark in both to respond to that. And also, Mark's a keen observer of national politics generally. You've talked about a couple threads of the Republicans in the Northeast have come up today. And I'm interested in your thoughts on, beyond the state levels where some governors in Connecticut and others have been long serving, is there much hope for Northeast Republican representation here in town?
Okay. Well, let me just quickly, I just want to pick up on this thread for a second.
Yeah.
Because what sometimes this kind of approach of saying, well, if you voted for a loser, you're not represented, bothers me a little bit. I mean, nothing is that fixed, and the real question is, what makes a representative feel like they have to pay attention to a particular set of voters. And the fact is, if you won with 51%, you probably feel some responsibility to pay attention to that 49%, unless they're clearly defined in a way that puts them out. And just to put some context on that, I was really interested a couple weeks ago, if you remember, after Congressman Joe Wilson from South Carolina said you lied to the president, and it became clear that he had a bitter feud with Representative James Clyburn, who represents a neighboring district. Both of them represent Columbia, South Carolina. Columbia, South Carolina is a town about the size of a metro area about the size of a congressional district. But for a whole host of reasons, one of them represents a heavily black majority district, Clyburn. One of them represents a very heavily white majority district. And as a result, you have one guy who can pay zero attention to the black voters in his district, and another one who can pay zero attention to the white voters in his district, and they represent some they get pulled to some fair extremes. It would be interesting to think about the context in which you had to have somebody who has to think about, how do I speak to both black and white constituents in Columbia, and that to me is kind of the question. You might win, but you're not going to win. You can't win with a purely white. I think Columbia is 50. I think the metro area is about 57-43 white. But you're not going to win all that. You're not. Let's say you were a Republican, you're not going to get all that white vote. You're going to need to get a little bit of the black vote. So when you add context like that, I think representation becomes more complicated. And the key is making sure that people are paying attention to people. I'm not that. If I vote for a loser, I'm not that fit. I don't walk away and say, "Hey, I didn't get represented." I don't really. It's rarely the case that one necessarily feels that way, and especially if they then do their job for you. I don't know, on Republicans in the Northeast. It is amazing to me, David, and you and I have had these conversations over the years not in these halls, but in our old offices. How hard the path for the Republican Party seems clear. It is a path that involves thinking more about the kind of things that just a more human face, not a raw Ayn Rand libertarian face, not a pure Christian conservative face, not an anti-immigrant face, but a face that thinks about some of the human supports that people need to function in this economy, bringing with it a kind of something from the living conservative tradition. And I think it's possible that something like that could take hold in New England in a way that, with, say, Governor Pawlenty, it's real in Minnesota. But I don't see it functioning as anything other than so far. All it is the safety valve. I mean, it makes perfect sense, I think, to have that safety valve. You have if you had a Democratic governor in Connecticut, they'd go wild. You have something that's a kind of check on them. I think people are in the end strategic voters more than political science quite gives them credit for, and having that check is real. It will be interesting. I mean, if a Republican argument nationally or in the congressional races this year becomes a coherent, we need a little bit of a check on the president and Congress, that I think might open up some opportunities, but I don't know. I mean, at the same time, the Connecticut Senate race is potentially competitive because of Senator Dodd's troubles, and maybe there's a little bit of room there.
Sure. Since you're not in these halls as frequently, I couldn't let the opportunity go to continue a long-standing conversation. Yeah, let's keep the questions for folks who haven't asked them though. Well, maybe have a chance later. Yeah, but we've got a lot of other hands though. Maybe we'll come back to it. The gentleman right here. Thanks.
Joe Rothstein, EIN News. I was wondering if you had any opinion about whether states that have had public financing for the legislature, like Arizona and Maine over a number of cycles, whether there's a qualitative difference in the people getting elected or the output of the legislative sessions as compared to other states.
I think Mark is probably best able to.
Yeah, I mean, it's very, very hard to do comparatives of any of those things. Because you can't all states, states have such different political cultures. There's definitely more women elected under those systems. We know that much. I don't think that anybody's really really figured out the way to get at legislative output. But anecdotally, you're seeing a somewhat different set of people who are able to run in those systems. I do say, it is funny sometimes. I used to do a lot of things with the folks from Maine, and talking about their system, and there's some really wonderful people. A waitress who was elected to the State House of Representatives. It's part of my argument for paying more attention to the New York City system. These folks are great. They represent constituencies of like 2,500 people. There are student council presidents in this country who represent more people. A city council member in New York represents half a congressional district. So there's a kind of scale, I think, to the people who are elected actually in the New York City system that really makes that, I think, an interesting test as a model compared to some of the states that have adopted reform.
Okay. I've seen a couple more hands go up.
Dave, can I make a quick comment on
Please,
that?
Stephen, yes.
A few years ago, I gave a talk in Arizona at the League of Women Voters annual convention there. And the League had been at the forefront of both pushing clean money public financing and also an independent redistricting commission, both of which they passed. And it was rather interesting to see the League expressing a great deal of disappointment at what they had, the results that had come as a result of those two reforms, and what they had discovered even more prominently, because they had, in a sense, ruled out that it could be necessarily inequities in campaign finance or who draws the district lines, was that Arizona, for example, in congressional districts, you have the state of Arizona, which down around Tucson is the Democratic area, and the rest of the state is all fairly solidly Republican. So unless you're going to draw districts that would look like the teeth of a fork going these long north-south districts, for example, you just couldn't draw competitive districts in Arizona, even if you gave candidates public financing of campaigns. And they found out similar things for their state legislative bodies as well, that pretty much both the partisan residential demographics as well as the fact that you had certain voters who are very fixed in their mind, many voters, about whether they vote Republican or Democrat, but those two combinations really make it pretty difficult in a state like Arizona, and I would say in most states, it's not that those reforms don't do good things, but they don't necessarily increase competition, and they don't necessarily change representation, and you think of Arizona in terms of the types of policies that have come out of that state, because many of the people pushing these things have been more from the progressive side of the aisle. It certainly hasn't made Arizona any more progressive.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The hands that were gone up before. Gentlemen?
How you doing? My name is Tiger. I'm not representing any organization. I just going to community college, and we had to come and watch a speech. So we were analyzing, diction and posture and all those kind of things. But this is a question more just.
Stand up straight.
Yeah, I was going to say. I wish I had known that at the beginning.
You guys were good. You guys were good. This is a question more out of curiosity than anything else. But I'm wondering as someone young person who's kind of new to the political process and all that, I'm wondering how do Barack Obama and John McCain and the major parties, the Republican and Democratic parties, how do they feel about not so much the reform that's still confusing to me, but the third party system. I remember watching Ross Perot, when he was running against Clinton, and my parents had me excited about the charts that he put up. I really thought he could win, but how do you feel like that third party system contributes to the political debate?
Frankie, speaking on your own behalf, not on the behalf of the Bloomberg campaign, do you have any comments or Mark?
Well, I think third parties do contribute to the debate. It's hard for them to win for all of the reasons that Stevens has talked about in terms of the winner-take-all system. But there's no question that Perot had a profound impact on that 92 race, and that third parties who are that are able to put up serious, well-organized, well-financed candidates can make a big difference and can kind of help to set the terms of the debate. And that is, most often been the role, I would say, that third parties have played with some electoral successes in various places over the decades. But generally, the role of the third parties has been to kind of push the debate in one direction or another. And I don't see that changing anytime soon without a change to more of a proportional representation or another type of system. Not advocating. I'm just saying that's the difficulty of our first cross the post system for a third party. And I think the challenge for the third parties out there is how do they organize? How do they raise money? How do they influence the debate? It's difficult to do. States govern the different parties in different ways. In New York, there's a very active tradition of third parties that doesn't exist elsewhere.
Well, I would just, I would add that one of the reasons for the active tradition of third parties in New York is the fusion law that you mentioned, which basically allows a party to run their own candidates when they want to and to endorse another party's candidates at other times, and especially when there's been some interplay. Like at certain points with the old Liberal Party, where there were Republicans they would endorse as well as Democrats, it creates a fairly rich tradition. It's almost impossible to think of if you want to create a third party, you really want it to operate at all levels. You want to be running for statewide offices. You want to be running for Congress. You can't do that in most states. I mean, you're just not going to even find a candidate 99% of the time, and so you'll always be sort of skating along the surface. You might have one candidate who has a lot of money running for president or running for Senate, who can maybe play a disruptive force but not really win because you don't kind of have the foundation underneath them. And fusion, which is allowed in 5 states but really only fully practiced in New York, gives those parties a different way to operate and exist. And I think Frankie pointed out some of the downside of the way that it kind of creates a sort of super grassroots factional group, which does largely operate within the Democratic Party now in the form of working families. But to the extent that working families also uses their leverage to sometimes say, we're not endorsing that Democrat, we're not going to endorse a corrupt Democrat, or we're not going to endorse an illiberal Democrat. That's a pretty strong foundation to play a lasting role in the state's politics, which you don't see anywhere else. I think on the whole, I think the benefits outweigh the problems created by that system.
Any other first-time questions?
My name is Lato B. Fagundes, and my question, I wanted to know if there were any implications or any thoughts concerning the state of civic education in the United States towards electoral reform movements, and if there was any sort of proposed solutions, or if this was even incorporated in the thought towards approaching electoral reform in the United States.
Civic education. Any of our 3 speakers have a thought?
Certainly don't have a solution.
We don't have a solution for it.
Thank you all
I'm
for
not
coming.
completely clear on what the question was.
On civic education, you mean some of the groups that are reform trying to broadly educate the rest of the population about the need for it?
I would.
There's a sense of a knowledge gap in what the general voters understand about the dynamics of the institutions. And so therefore it's difficult to ask voters
I see.
to approach electoral reform if there's large knowledge gaps on how their institutions function.
I'll give a quick response, which is to give you an example of what's been done in New York City to try to bridge that gap, not in schools, but to the general electorate, which is the city produces a voter's guide, which is mailed to every registered household, which has information on the candidate, a candidate statement, some bios, that kind of thing. So it provides the interested voter, at least, with a bit of information about the candidate. We also now do a video voter guide, which runs on the city's municipal access channels. So if you're watching TV in the next few weeks in the city, you would see, if you came across Channel 74, statements, 3-minute statements from city council candidates all the way up through mayor, talking about why they think voters should vote for them. So I think giving voters platforms, finding ways to give them public platforms to get their message out is one way to engage the public. But in terms of the broader issue of civic education in schools, that's a tough one.
Very good.
One thing I can add to that we at New America have been working on is we in California we've been one of the main organizations behind a bill to lower the voter registration age to 17. And the strategy behind this is that by lowering it to 17, you allow high schools in particular to be more vehicles for engaging young people, and it really enhances peer-to-peer contact where students can get excited and go register their fellow students and teachers. Other places that have done things like this in Wisconsin, for example, they have a teacher or staff person who acts as a registration deputy to receive the materials and help disseminate them. So in a small ball sort of way, it's a strategic avenue to really try to enhance civic education in high schools. And that bill is sitting on Governor Schwarzenegger's desk right now. We're hoping he's going to sign it, but right now he's threatening to veto all 700 bills sitting on his desk if he doesn't get the water bill that he wants. So
Yep.
I can't wait to explain that to the young people.
Yeah, love government. Just follow up quickly. You had a question on the conventions. Remind me again.
The elephant in the room here is you haven't talked about the fact that if you want to pass the proportional representation in the United States, you have to have a constitutional amendment. And there's many other things that were discussed that could be done that, would focus more on raising the participation, which currently is like between 58 and 62%. It's only up to 62 in the last two, or three really competitive, vicious elections.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Frankie, any thought on that or
Really
last
like
words,
Mr.
Jenna?
Schmidt, because he's the realist on this panel.
Well, it's Frankie's book. We'll give Frankie the last word.
No, I'll let Mark talk. Other than to say
All
that
right.
I think a lot of things we've been talking about are things that that are happening at the state and local level. So I hadn't even been contemplating proportional representation at the federal level. Maybe others had. Maybe Stephen and others would like to see it. But I think we've been talking really about state and local initiatives, and cities and states can do proportional representation without a federal constitutional amendment.
I'm sorry,
Mark,
I was
yeah.
responding to Mr. Hill.
Yeah, it's all right. Mark, do you have a final word as we go?
Yeah, as a realist, yeah, I don't. I mean, I think there are things you could do some proportional representation even for congressional seats. You could have multi-member districts without a constitutional amendment. You could, for example, there's a movement afoot, and I know Steve knows a lot about this, to basically substitute for the Electoral College by a compact of states, a national popular vote, by a compact of states kind of agreeing to honor the popular vote without a constitutional amendment. So it's not always that it has to be a constitutional amendment. As a realist, I tend to sort of look at both of those things and say, well, that's not necessarily where I want to put my particular energy or interest, but they're there, and that's and the Constitution isn't. We often think the Constitution is an obstacle when it isn't, but there are other obstacles.
Yeah. And Stephen, final word before you get back to the water bill.
Well, I want to say that, first of all, I just noticed on the live web stream you put my photo up in there, but I'm disappointed you don't have my mouth moving like in a Conan O'Brien sort of...
We're working on upgrading the technology as we speak.
Yeah. So anyway, no, I just, it's been a great forum, and kudos to Frankie for writing the book and then for having this forum to pull it together to talk about reform. I think it's... I think we're moving into kind of a new era in lots of ways, on a global level, on a national level, and a lot of the things that we've been using for many, many years aren't necessarily going to be the institutions and practices that are going to be best for the 21st century, I don't believe. I think that now's the time for people to really start thinking outside the box about what really are the problems of our democracy? What are the best methods to fix them? Let's not be so often. People start saying, "Oh, the founders and framers intended this way or that way." But when you read the passages of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and you read the debates of that during that period, you see that the brilliant founders and framers were completely confused. They had no idea what they were doing. Certain proposals that were introduced about how to elect the president and then passed 3 days later were turned away. And then 3 weeks later it reappears again in different form. And then 4 weeks after that they try again. And so you just see this long meandering trail of proposals as they basically fumbled their way to what we now know as the U.S. political system. And so the thing that we can take hard from what the founders and framers did is that not that they were brilliant and we're not, but that even within their confusion, they plunged forward anyway and came up with what at the time was pretty cutting-edge stuff when it comes to democracy. But here in the 21st century, what was cutting edge in the 18th century just doesn't cut it anymore. And I think we really have to start looking at some of these new methods that are being used around the world and not be afraid that somehow they're un-American. We should have an air of experimentation to what we're doing at this point, I believe.
Very good. Spoken like a true Californian. I wanted to thank Stephen and Mark and Frankie for being with us today, and all of you for joining us both in person and on the net. I appreciated this discussion very much. We're at 1:30, so I will call us adjourned. Have a good afternoon.